Hey, what's up, everyone? My name is Joshua. I want to welcome you to another broadcast. Today, on a conversation with Joshua T. Berglan, we have a really amazing human being that's going to be calling in. His name's Cyrus, and he has been locked up for a very long time in MSOP. And if you're not familiar with MSOP, you've heard us talk about the sex offender program and civil commitment over the last year. We've had several different broadcasts with family members. Of course, we publish some of the blogs from some of the loved ones who, some of their loved ones are locked up in these shadow prisons. And today we're going to be broadcasting from MSOP in Moose Lake, Minnesota, and talking to a gentleman. He's not an attorney, but from my understanding, he has all the qualifications to be an attorney. And I think he's in his 70s now. He's a really pleasant, awesome guy. I've had several conversations with him. He's very interesting. And I don't know, like I just have a love for him. And last night he called me ahead of this interview, and he shared with me some things that I'm going to let him share with you that are pretty heavy and hard to digest. But nonetheless, his story deserves and needs to be heard because I believe that it impacts a lot of people. Now, today I'm wearing a shirt in support of End MSOP, and you can check out their Facebook group at facebook.com/End MSOP. I hope that's what it says. But I'm wearing this shirt today because this is not only to show support to all of the people that are locked up in these shadow prisons and specifically MSOP, but my heart goes out to everyone that's locked up in these facilities all over the country. And man, I got to tell you, I love doing really exciting and passionate and fiery broadcast, but sometimes I can't do that. I believe what we are dealing with these shadow prisons and civil commitment here is horrific. But anyway, we're going to hear from Cyrus today. Here we go.
This is a pre-poll
That's him.
recorded. Your call will now be connected. Thank you for using now.
Cyrus, the only I'm the only reason why I ever know it's you is because you don't say your name. Oh man, I'm rocking my End MSOP sweatshirt. So when you see Daniel and them, tell them I have it on. I love it, and I just got it in the mail today. Yeah. Oh, it's comfy. It's nice. And as I was telling the audience before you called, I stand with you guys. I stand with you, your families, and loved ones. And I'm really blessed and honored to have you here today, man. As we talked about before, I just want to give you the floor. And as I feel led, I'll ask questions, but I want you to share what's on your heart, sir.
Some time ago, that I would discuss a little bit about in order was coined by a professor. We're sort of at risk of becoming a preventive state, you might say, in which there's a paradigm of governmental social and depriving of their liberty. And that's what's been really quite troubling from a standpoint of American law, because this sort of stands alone thus far. And there may be others if this is allowed to continue to exist, which is one thing that makes it extraordinarily. Primary purpose of these laws has really not been about treatment, although that's been sometimes talked about. But really, in reality, it's about incapacitation, prevention, that is, from committing future crimes of sexualism, effectively as if they were in prison. There is not really a person by his very nature really driven to commit crimes of most violent sort. Often that's against multiple victims, and I think that this notion has really been what's at the heart of causing all of the public fear about it. And they've used words that really are deliberately inflammatory, such as predator, sexual predator, home right discrimination in the past, such as, for instance, race or gender or sexual orientation. other forms of law, and yet sex offenders most frequently are not. So there's a matter of to be acknowledged cognitively by people as well as politically recognized. There really has to be, so they could say, some groups that don't have rights, and that's the difference between virtual reference to this notion of outsider groups. So this is a very serious thing that we're talking about here that has great implications. I should say great sense of great good, but really bad implications. The traditional liberty and security balance literally evolved for all people in America, whether it's not come to think of it, that transitions from the notion of criminal justice by reason of a matter of personal friends. So it's very troubling stuff. And also, it all sort of depends on how much risk, as they would say, unfortunately. And he was being tried for civil commitment. In his case, 3 experts that testified in trial said that in view of his age, bring back verdict now. So the jury came back and surprisingly short amount of time announcing that they found. He said, "Well, hold on, before you go, let me just try to find out why you did this." In light of the fact that everybody in the industry agreed with this guy had no higher than a 1% chance of reoffense. And the foreman of the jury told the judge, we were talking about that, but we decided relatively quickly that although 1% may in general seem to be thought that was unacceptable.
Wow.
I think what we kind of come to in this country because of reasoning like that, which is really fear-based, it isn't really based on any kind of rational judgment of the vote. But that is not the way I don't believe that American justice should ever be run. And I feel very sorry for that man. And in fact, I'm frankly pretty much very close to his same way. I was committed. And so I think.
What? Can you say that age again?
Yes, I was committed at age 62, I think.
Okay.
And I'm 70, and I'm 71 now. And as you can see, that's 9 years. And frankly, I'm not showing any signs of being anywhere near done with this program, which is another thing. It's a travesty to call this a treatment program. It's just simply a containment or a confinement program with a little bit of treatment dollars across the top to kind of help disguise what it really is all about. Let's see. I've a writer who's been researching this subject a great deal. Her name is Hudson, and she, as she puts it, the demand for safety when it comes to sexuality matters is insatiable. So that is to say, there's no. You could literally have anybody who just might be loosely rumored to have some completely unquantifiable but microscopic level, not just at 1%, but maybe at 1/100 of 1%. And if you could actually quantify it at that level, of course, so that would say that would be. Now, let me move along here. Because there's this history of, let's just call it fear and loathing perverts, let's use a word like that, I feel it's sometimes appropriate to be a little bit inflammatory about these things, simply to remind people that's really something that's really happening in their minds, even when they're not conscious of it. That is to say, there is this effect, rather, of unconsciously departing from rationality and getting simply into the feeling. So we have this point, but let's stop and talk about this development of things. I wanted to say that most recently, since the 1980s, there have been authors that have claimed that this is how far this goes, for instance, in having ever been sexually. Don't have to remember that to know that it occurred. And the famous quote from one of the authors who writes most about that, or did for many years there. And she said, and I might hasten to add that what she was pointing to and others besides her were pointing to at the times, and still to this very day sometimes, are things as trivial and completely disconnected as things of neglect of one's teeth, or as having asthma, of passive use, which of course they're not. But in any event, this kind of illustrates the kind of departure from rationality that you see people engaging in when fear. So there was she in fact was treating offenders for many years in New York State, sex offenders, sometimes with like attraction sport, take someone memorably. She said, "Show me a heterosexual." Instead, what we'd always do is just to hide these teams, we circle the wagons, so to speak, and project that danger outward as if they're hovering in the shadows. But indeed, it is largely there. The
You have one.
You can continue. You can call. Don't you have to call back?
Yes, I was fine.
Call Cyrus the professor, because that guy, he just knows. I don't. I want to ask him. I want him to talk. So the reason why you're not hearing me ask questions is I want to give every one of these guys the opportunity to speak and share what they feel led to share, and without interruption. But I do have questions for him. But I'm going to let him talk until it's time. This, so the hoodie I'm wearing, and you can't see it because this is just going to be podcast only. But this is a fundraiser, and of course, I'm going to shoot a video for this here in a little bit. But I wanted to share some things until he calls. When the MSOP, which is Minnesota Sex Offender Program, was first developed, lawmakers promised that it would make our communities safer. 30 years later, research shows, and this is real research, because I've shared this on the other broadcast I've done. Research shows that the program has done nothing to protect our women, children, or vulnerable loved ones. If anything, it's gotten worse. Anyway, there's more to this.
Hello. This calls are subject to monitoring and may be recorded. Your call will now be connected. Thank you for using email.
Welcome back, Cyrus.
Yes, and we were just talking about dangerous being outside of the very place where it usually occurs, unfortunately, which is family households. Instead, thinking that there's some mythical creatures out there and we can call them by any names, but the one I'd like to use right now would be one that really has pervaded this thing and reappeared time and time again, despite all sorts of professional and scientific aims to squelch it, because it really is purely inflammatory in intent as well as effect. And that's the terps. So what I really want to do is step back in history now and give you a thumbnail sketch of how the 1885, no less, a fellow by the name of, this is his last name, Kraft, this is an Austrian psychiatrist, was that he had an enormous list of repellent, revulsive disgust for any matters of sexuality that were not was it became kind of a natural hop, skip, and a jump for people to start using that as a turnaround term to refer to people who actually simply had some kind of deviation from the average norm. This proceeded mushrooms, or literally a completely subjective, reactive basis, and he literally found some really horribly scathing and over the top work to say about anyone who had anything other than that. So that was where this all really got started. It was a period whereby, after about maybe this turn of the century, in the 1900s, this was, many countries started to pass laws that allowed for confinement of people who literally had anything that was not considered of that normal nature, including just plain old homosexuals. Today, we would regard that as completely over the top, but it certainly was the style of the time. And we basically went on like that, but with progressively a little bit diminishing interest in that. It's sort of like significance that was no longer the reason for a range of passage of new laws until we got to the mid and late 1930s. And during that time, you may recall, personally, of course, but hearing about the Depression, and that wasn't just the United States, by the way. It was actually worldwide, certainly throughout all the Western world, Europe as well, where it actually started first, by the way, in the 1920s, down to town in America State, even if necessary, looking for work because they couldn't find anywhere they were. Where they were probably called hobos, you may recall, have you heard that term?
Yeah.
And they truly did ride the rails and hitchhike, et cetera, et cetera. But they became the subject of a great deal of suspicion by people who didn't like their presence, thought that because of their impoverishment, they might attempt to commit crimes having to do with theft and that sort of thing. And ultimately, this brought down when a certain number of sex crimes would happen in a given city, they would probably turn to all the hobos as the probable suspects, whether they were or not. So this ultimately created that same kind of fear of the people who were like outside of our communities, even though they were physically present in them. And the upshot was that almost all states at that time started to pass legislation that literally said that if you commit sex crimes of this type or that type, you will be eligible not only for a prison sentence but also for sexual offender commitment under civil laws. So that's really where that whole thing started back in the late 1930s. Minnesota, for instance, had one. About 30 states in all had that peak of it had those kind of laws. Minnesota, in fact, literally at that peak of it had about 50 guys under lock and key for that, even though their crimes were relatively minor by those kind of standards. I recall reading about some who literally were just simply occasional exhibitionists. And although that's certainly not something to be lauded, but the cosmic scale of sex crimes that probably doesn't rate quite as high as others. And yet these fellows would be regularly locked up as if this went on for some time into about the mid 1950s, at which time, once again, the excitement about all this had rather died aside. And that meant that laws were not only not being passed anymore on that basis, but in fact, many of the states that had them were beginning to ruin the day they had, seeing that it was a bit of a misuse of civil commitment and was causing mistakes somebody to keep these guys put up indefinitely. And by the way, in those laws, just like today, almost none of them were released. They literally spent the rest of their lives and died in commitment. In any event, so about by the time we reached the late 1960s, the trend turned around the other way. And one by one, the states that passed these laws, almost all of them, except for Minnesota and a few others, I think all there were six that retained them, but the rest let them go and repealed the laws. Now, that brings us up now to the present time, starting basically in the late 1980s, when in a few states, some really extraordinary inflammatory crimes that hit the front line headline literally caught the public's interest and became almost immediately the subject of interest by people whose job it is. And by the way, these people really exist to try to talk to the public about various things in order to gain some kind of traction for a legislative movement. And sometimes that's because they honestly feel the movement is necessary, but other times it's just as common among the people who do this for a living that it's all rather just a matter of the smoke and mirrors, the appearances, the ability to exaggerate dangers and the like, and make everything seem more extreme than it really is. So this process began in earnest, such that in 1990, the state of Washington created the first of these new generation of sex offender commitment laws, and that was followed in fairly quick order over the next 7 or 8 years or so by about another 15 states. And ultimately, the total now has come to 20, although I don't think there's been a state that's actually enacted it. It's New York, and that was in 2006, as I recall. So it really eventually sort of like petered out and probably won't get any states on board. And the reasoning is because that the other states have seen this for what it is, really quite a boondoggle that costs a great deal of money every year in cost, which is another whole discussion all by itself. But the research that's looked into this has really discovered that despite what you do, or whether you commit these guys, whether you just treat them with or without commitment somewhere else, maybe for instance, really neither the treatment nor especially not the commitment makes a difference on sexual offending when it comes to the rate of sexual offenses in any given state. It didn't get lowered one bit. They cut out to these laws. And once more, the people that get committed, there have been a number of states that have actually let out a significant percentage of those that they committed, or at least they did for a while. Eventually, that became politically unpopular, but simply, once again, by people beating the downtown drums of fear and loathing, but not having any rational basis. Science is completely contrary to it. So they literally forced the legislators to pass laws that bar people from getting out in those cases. But while they were letting them out, in the case of Florida, for instance, it's a classic example of this. They let out, I think it was something like 60 guys, I believe it was, and literally not one of them committed another sex crime. Now, these guys were guys that had completely out of self-control, lathering maniacs if ever there were any, so the accusation went. Yet when they walked out the doors, they didn't commit any sex crimes. So those who get put in commitment facilities, myself included, are not of that character. And we are not lathering maniacs, and we are not out of self-control. In fact, actually, those people who know anything about sexual offending will tell you that it is, among all crimes, probably in fact, no problem about it is the rated crime, should I, that sort of thing, literally taking weeks, months, sometimes even more than a year to debate whether or not to commit a given projected sex crime that someone thinks about. So out the window goes the notion of this thing being a sudden spontaneous impulse that suddenly cannot be denied, it must be obeyed, as if someone were in a trance or something. That's just such total mythical fiction. It really isn't worth really.
Wait a second.
Anymore.
Now, this brings up something that I want to ask you about,
Yeah.
though, because I know that there's a difference. Not all sex offenders are sex addicts, and now a sex addict, though, or a chemsex addict, like in my case, that pool. I mean, it, like with any addiction, I think anyone out there that's ever suffered with addiction can relate to whatever that addiction is. You almost feel like you're being pulled to it like a magnet, and it does feel like it's out of the person's control. Can you speak to the difference between, if there is a way to do this, the difference between a sex addict and a sex offender from your point of view?
Yeah. And I have to tell you, and I hope this doesn't run contrary to what your experience seems to tell you, but the notion of sex addiction is not parallel really to the notion of chemical dependence. So that literally, in most cases, by the time it really takes hold and binds hard, it's really a physical dependency, obviously. What sexual addiction really amounts to is the drive, if you will, a sense of such a strong attraction to doing something that they are aware is not allowed by the law, such that they feel that they're being literally drawn to it almost irresistible. It is a resistible thing. And what it usually requires is a relatively brief and not terribly psychological therapy that's more in the nature of counseling and group processing, which also amounts to group counseling when you think about it, to essentially bring that under some degree of sense of controllability, self-controllability.
You have 1 minute remaining.
As I say never, because there's always people that basically defy not only God, but the ability to describe, their experience in terms of frameworks of some kind of science. But generally speaking, that's the truth. Now, there are, quite frankly, among us here in this facility, some fellows who are literally of the stripe of people that really feel very strongly about wanting to have sex, and frankly, a number of them are homosexual very clearly, and they literally foot about trying to find opportunities to do that very thing. But I think the truth is that probably most psychologists would not call that an addiction. That's just something that's very personally important to them on an emotional level, is what it really comes down to. And I know that may sound like it's splitting hairs from a standpoint of actual conduct, but really the truth is that when there's this incentive that is strong,
Thank you for using TTL.
Matt, Jim Tan Laundry. He'll call back, I'm pretty sure. He said something that I want to address. Oh, I know what it was. we have people that identify sexually with cats now. In other words, they see themselves as a cat and their sexuality is, I don't know if this was a joke, but I saw something about a couch. Two, human sexuality is a weird thing. It is weird. It's complicated. It's not one size fits all. Forgive the pun. It's so freaking complicated. And I'm in the things that make us attracted to or do the things that we want to do or the desires that we have. It's complicated and there's a reason. I would like to get into the reason why somebody would be attracted to a minor. Like, I don't understand it, but there's got to be a psychological reason.
Hello. This is a call for subject to monitoring and may be
Not that I'm
recorded.
justified.
Your call will now be connected. Thank you for using GTL.
Go ahead, sir.
Argument that was based on the fact that there was a fair amount of recidivism. That was based on the fact that early penalties for sex offenses, certainly all penalties in a sex crime, you would listen to that and you'd say, "Oh my God, I'm not doing that." That's what you're saying. So I don't think that it accounts for anywhere near that kind of for you on that question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for that answer.
Yeah. Let's see. I was kind of going to gather my thoughts. Oh dear. I also wanted to talk about how this almost like hysterical sex crime fear that was going on from the mid 80s on forward really took quite a social toll throughout society in general. There were, for instance, just a spectacular number of accusations that erupted around the country having to do with daycare centers of all things. Really tiny, a cookie cutter kind of accusations talk about things like what they usually say, something about some kind of a satanic cult, I guess was the phrase. That's right. In any event, really when all the smoke and dust cleared from the scene and all the facts were down, what emerged is that literally what had happened was that somebody somewhere had gotten hysterical, put either their child or other people's children, if they were some official somewhere, through a real meat grinder, a series of interrogations until the children told them what they wanted to hear. And children, although they are mostly naive, once they are put through such kind of interrogation, catch on so brilliantly quickly that they really do understand before too long what's being asked of them and realizing that they're probably not going to be left to themselves until they come off the ghost, so to speak, and they simply just say, "Oh, yeah, sure, it happened," when in fact it, yeah, so it accounts for a lot. Accounts, by the way, for why you would expect that if some child were actually to be recounting some true instance of that kind of thing, you would expect all sorts of part of the child and making that kind of accusation.
From my standpoint, I remember vividly every detail of what happened to me. It's never escaped me. I can't remember what I did yesterday, but the day I was molested the first time and every time after, I remember in detail. So
Okay.
I support what you're saying.
Right. Yes. Yeah. The thing about it is that, as I was saying, I've seen many of these interviews really eerie to the point of being, you would think, self-evidently doubtful, because you would hear them carry on with these absolutely nonchalant statements that were recounting of supposedly the most horrific actions having been done to them. It's not something that you would ever expect in human experience to have somebody do that. Like I say, it would really be quite an emotional, wrenching thing to have to say those things. But oftentimes that's just not there. And that should be a tell, quite frankly. But for the longest time, it wasn't regarded as a tell because people were in such a mode that I call the will to by the concept of something to the point where you just have an undying desire to believe that's what happened, then you just persist. Like all mitigation is contrary. Yeah. In any event, I'm sorry for your experience, by the way. And sure it was. There's just with all this stuff, it turned out in the end was not only recklessly done, and in most cases really was sort of a witch hunt without witches, if you will. Just people thinking that crimes had happened on an assembly line basis when in fact no such assembly line happened. And maybe there was a sex crime that sort of like actually did happen. It maybe in, say, for instance, a daycare center somewhere. But when all was said and done, it was simply one random off the top employee who basically did something off the top crazy to some portable assembly line everywhere. Yeah. So what that sort of turned out to be was something that got hijacked, if you will, by forces that really wanted to use that kind of stuff as an illustration of why not just sex crimes should be reined in more tightly, but really so that everything else about American society that involved sex should actually be equally tightly restricted. That's it became the grist, if you will, of conservative movements that were literally trying to take American society, I would say, back, but I think their imaginings of what American society used to be like in the late 1800s and even earlier than that were not even correct. I know my history fairly well. It certainly was not the case. They were simply creating this image of what supposedly America was like at some time in the past, and then simply saying everybody should jump back to this, which is to say to go to whatever we're advocating as a new mode of acceptable conduct in American society that's much more restricted than it was before, because we're trying to avoid these rather troublesome. Yeah, and by the way, there's something that basically could be said in this terms, and the note that I wrote out is sort of like a paraphrase, almost like quote, affective, emotional affect, in other words, conventions of sexuality, in particular sexual shame, stigma, fear, disgust, they enforce and reinforce this regulatory system and are therefore political. In its wake, this panic of moral panics, if you want to call it that, legitimizes and enhances the power to fostering the illusion of a singular public. In other words, all mobilized in lockstep, if you will, in support of so-called traditional values, whether in fact actually they were traditional or not. So there you have it. I guess maybe I won't probably beat the drum any longer about the notion of moral panics, but it literally is something that time and time again has been used to try to both create the current situation, not only regarding sex offender commitment, but on a much broader level to justify the whole notion of sex offender registration, by the way, and of all sorts of restrictions on people who have had mass sex offenses, whether they were on probation or whether they were in prison and afterwards encountered these restrictions. And it's very broad. I mean, in all candor, there are probably about 7,000, maybe even a couple hundred less than that, of people locked up right now in sex offenders civil commitment facilities. I don't think that fact, because it's so few comparatively, should be taken lightly. In fact, actually, I think because of the enormity of depriving people of their freedom for the rest of their life just because somebody thinks that they might someday commit a crime is about as horrendous as it gets.
Yep, I
But by
agree.
the same token, on the other side of the coin, when you look at literally, I think it's 1.5 million now, people who are literally under some form of sex offender registration by law because of past sex crimes that they've committed at some point in their life, even if it was a long, long time ago. By the way, includes people who committed sex crimes when they were juveniles. So, I mean, that's how we got to this 1.5 million thing. A surprising percentage of sex crimes are actually committed by people who aren't 18 yet. Last my memory sometimes goes, but then it's helpful to try now. But you know what I'm talking about. There's various chemicals that float around.
Are you talking about testosterone?
I'm sorry.
Are you saying testosterone?
There's obviously these days various antagonists to testosterone. which have been sort of enlisted in the notion that that would somehow prevent sex crimes by people who seem to, by their records, already be predisposed to do them. But that's also a false reality too. That doesn't really exist. That it's a significant problem because it turns out that taking what they're called testosterone agonists, now that I got the name back in my mind,
You have 1 minute remaining.
just kidding, ridiculous. This is the short one. It does this periodically. That's something else. But in any event, let me just finish up about this topic by saying that these testosterone agonists have really very serious physical side effects, including most probably, first of all, at any age. And another set of things has to do with the impacts on your liver and your kidneys, and they're very bad for those as well. So this time, I want to know if you want to continue, because
Let's do one more.
I'll have to have a little longer break. I'm sorry?
Let's do one more.
Okay, but can you give me about 5 minutes this time? I have to take a break for physical reasons.
Yes, sir. I understand. I can talk for 5 minutes.
Okay, hold that tight and I'll be back.
Yes,
Thank you.
sir.
Bye.
See you in a second. So much information. That's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing at all. I wonder, I want to get back to this thing, these facts, this fact sheet, but I just wonder how many people actually give a crap. And I keep thinking about in the Bible how it talks about at the end of days, and whether this is the end of days or not is up to, that's, I don't know. It's up to God. Yeah, the signs are everywhere, but I'm pretty sure over the history of the human species that they've had these scares or felt like this was the end several different times. Of course, it does feel like we're going there. But my point is that it says in the end of days, people will be lovers of themselves and selfish and yada. And I wonder, like, how many people actually recognize the threat that this is to them. And it's a sneaky one. Now, from my understanding, Cyrus, I want him to say it. I don't want to be the one to say it. And the reason why is because I don't want, if I misheard something he told me, I don't want to, like I, for instance, thought he was 75 or 76. And he's 71. So if I misheard something, I don't want to say it as fact. But seriously, what's happening there is awful. And if you haven't heard the episode, Why You Need to Care About Civil Commitment, please listen to it or watch it. Because in that episode, I read the messages, and I have more. I've had more messages since I did that broadcast about what's happening in the Texas facility. It's a nightmare. And there's a lot of innocent people that are there. There's guilty people too. There's also guilty people that serve their time. Some of the guilty people were minors when they committed their offense. They committed with another minor, but for whatever reason, is considered sex offense. And then that's another thing that's very interesting to me is that, and listen, the people that molested me, I can't say are sex offenders. I can't say that. And I wonder, what's the difference between the two? Does that, anytime that somebody rapes somebody else, does that make them a sex offender? Or is it an incident? Do you factor in them being on drugs or whatever else? Does that factor in? Does it factor in? He was talking about testosterone. Of course, it reminds me now of James Cameron, the guy that wrote, he was the original Terminator director, right? And then Avatar. There's an Avatar 5. I just like Avatar 1, and then it went from 1 to 5. How'd that happen? Did I miss something? Anyway, that's off track. But he's been in the news saying that testosterone is poison. Do you know what happens when your body's low on testosterone? Everything starts to shut down. It's not just your willy doesn't want to work. Like low testosterone is not good for you. But then, of course, elevated testosterone is not good for you either. But we were designed and created to have testosterone for a reason. So it's interesting that he's talking about this. I remember taking steroids when I was young. Of course, I would have taken anything back then. But I did so much damage to my body, steroids, stimulants, all of it. But I remember being on steroids, but taking testosterone. First of all, again, I was a chemsex addict too. So like I was feeding a demon. And the testosterone, but it didn't help. But again, it was elevated. It was more than what was natural. But my mind was already wired for destruction. And I just wonder what I was saying before the break is that I wonder if what causes this to happen? What causes an adult to be attracted to minors that they would do that? Like, how can you look at a minor and go, they're sexy? And like, how does that happen? I can't understand it. But I also like, women that are developed. There's just so much about this I don't understand. But at the same time, again, I don't understand that, but I also don't understand aligning my sexuality with a cat or some of the other weird things that I'm sure were just for attention. But I don't understand like agender. I don't understand non-binary. I don't understand a lot of the new sexualities. I barely understand my own. Because like that's why I hate labels so much. And yes, I know I'm the world's mayor. But know what the world's mayor means. It doesn't. It's not as egocentric as it sounds. It's a mindset and it's about other people, not me, even though I'm calling myself the world's mayor. You don't have to believe that, but it's true. And those that were there the day that the name was given to me will know all about it. So I want to read this really quick. But after almost 30 years, this is what I was reading before he called. Research shows that the program has done nothing to protect our women, children, or vulnerable loved ones. Eric Janus, I think is his name, he's the former president and dean of Mitchell Hamlin School of Law, has said, do not spend money on these programs. Figure out other ways of using our resources to fight sexual violence. Here's something for you. There are other programs besides MSOP that are effective in preventing sexual violence. Stop It Now, PAVSA, which is PAVSA, and then there's MN CASA. There's more. But they are struggling financially because lawmakers insist on spending over $100 million every year on MSOP, even though they know it doesn't work. I wonder if it's money laundering. Never mind, that's a whole other broadcast. You can be part of the solution. Oh, okay. Sorry. So these hoodies that are for sale, the 100% of the profits from this hoodie will go towards educating the public concerning the issue, as well as supporting the programs that protect our communities from sexual violence. To order your Stop Sexual Violence hoodie, click on the link below. There's no link yet. Hold on. Contact at embroiderydad.com. That's how you order them. Hold on.
Hello. Calls are subject to monitoring and may be recorded. Your call will now be connected. Thank you for using GPL.
Oh,
Yellowstone. Oh no, not at all. I've just been sitting here. Oh no, mine would go to voicemail. Yes, sir. Oh, I know. I know you're just scratching the surface. But what I would like to do for the sake of the listening audience is have you come back because this is such heavy and detailed information and it's going to be over an hour. So we should do it again because digesting this alone is going to be a lot for people. So go ahead and share what else you need to share. And of course, you're welcome back, Cyrus. I love talking to you. So you're welcome back anytime.
thank you very much. And yes, I'll try to deserve it. In any event. So I wanted to say something that I had not said before, but I think it's really very vital and important to show you how much this whole thing was politically twisted. In the time when they were trying to make arguments for these new laws, everything from ratcheting up the penalties right up to the sex offender registration and the commitments, of course, to sex offenders, all of it was by people who made arguments. There were supposedly, well, it was supposedly a massive recidivism percentage by sex offenders as compared to other crimes. There was a fellow, by the way, who picked it all off in an article in Popular Psychology, not exactly a peer-reviewed journal, in 1986, called the last what Mr. Human Longo proposed was that sex offender recidivism was supposedly at 80% or higher, and recidivism. And that really it was not true even remotely. In fact, actually, all studies of recidivism, even the ones a tiny fraction of that, there were some that basically had put forth initially later by a fellow by the name of Carl Hansen out of Canada in studies in which he claimed that the average rate of recidivism. But his rate of 17% was derived from people who literally had been imprisoned way back in the 70s under the very same catch and release provisions that I was talking about, and thus felt really quite powerful to go ahead and reinvent it, just penalty the consequences, so to speak, back then. And ever since these new penalties have been increased so dramatically, that's gone away almost wholesale, such that in the last 20 years, there's been no study that's been peer reviewed that's come up with an average recidivism rate. Now, it's average, including people who have recidivated already, percent, higher than about 3.5%. And most of it is far less than that. So, what that means is that if you compare that to other crimes, in fact, actually, sex offending is the lowest, literally the lowest recidivism rate of any crime. And it's just a little bit lower than first degree murders, which, aside from the ones that are heat of passion murders, the kind of murders that are essentially committed by people who get paid to commit murders, but otherwise than that is a very low rate itself. But so yeah, it's the myth of completely insane recidivism is a myth, just pure and simple. And it's the reason that's important is because when the U.S. Supreme Court made its decision authorizing these four justices against and a middle justice, who would essentially lead toward the four, so it has to allow that. And that's how that decision happened. But that was Justice Kennedy, and Justice Kennedy said something that really caught everybody's eyes. He said, yeah, so we have to do something. He said, and so he went with it. But he was literally flabbergasted by that complete set of lies about 80%. It's just appalling what people will do. Anyway, and by the way, Congress did the very same thing a number of times subsequently. And I won't get you into all that. Anyway, yeah, there were people said really terrible things about not only recidivism, but supposedly about complete lack of self-control and everything, and all that was later utterly debunked. There is an outfit called Health America, and this is an organization of psychiatrists who basically feel very strongly that psychiatry and notions of mental health should not be misused for purposes of just creating political gain by people who literally want to be reelected in office or elected for the first time by pounding on desks and saying sometimes about sex offenders. Oh yeah. So this organization, Mental Health America, or MHA for short, believes that these laws don't constitute sound public policy, and the laws focus on punishment rather than treatment and deal with people who often don't have any treatable mental illness. And that goal is to increase the stigma and distorts civil commitment for the safety of other persons in mental health facilities to the extent that they're combined with people who are in facilities for allegedly having some problem with controlling their sexual actions. Yeah, divert resources, most importantly, from mental health care and inappropriately burden the mental health system with a criminal justice function for which it's not funded or equipped. And there currently is a great deal of research going on about this, by the way. And that research isn't really into whether that's true. In fact, the research has all been one-sided for a very long time, saying, yes, indeed, that is very true. That literally, if you really want to confine people, you should be using the criminal justice system, if only because it's vastly cheaper than to, which of course has to be staffed by psychologists. Therefore, it gets very expensive. And, really, the mental health community ought to be left out of this debate about what to do about sex offenders and what their position is. This MHA organization, and I couldn't agree more. And they advance several postulates for that, so several propositions. Some often don't have any treatable mental illness whatsoever. That people who are committed as sex offenders are being confined for a lengthy period without any regular appropriate review of whether they should be. And that once they're confined as a sexual so-called predator, it's difficult politically, the will isn't there, and so the statutes have literally been stacked against release. And that is, by the way, very true in the States, so we're having quite a problem in that regard here. But all states make the release of sexual predators much more, shall we say, onerous than ordinary civil commitment in ways that really demonstrate and exacerbate, really, the punitive nature. So basically, their point is that sexual predator legislation, as it's called, is criminal justice legislation, and that being applied against people who have already been convicted and served a term of imprisonment, and therefore it's unfair to just someone effectively punish them a second. Yeah, especially because when you tried them for the crime in the first place, if they tried to make a defense of being mentally ill and therefore not responsible for the crime, that would get brushed aside, and you'd say, well, you certainly did know what you were doing, and you had thorough control of your actions. And now comes commitment time, and say, wait a minute, we can't let you go because you don't have control of your actions. Wow. Talk about inconsistency. Where in the meantime, they lost control of their actions, but they haven't control of the time of the crime. Wow. That's pretty ironic.
Absolutely. And it's frightening that these psychiatrists have so much power when they're practicing medicine. Like it's a practice. They don't have it down. There's no exact science to these diagnoses, and making these determinations is dangerous. You're giving them the power of God, basically. And that's a problem, especially if you know the field of psychiatry.
It's not funny to say this, but one person who was writing in the field that was advocating for sex offender women in the early years literally said that. He said, because I'm a psychiatrist, I have the sense of power of God over these people. Oof. It was appalling, I must say. But I guess I couldn't agree with you more. I guess my take on that is that it certainly applies to the notion of diagnosis, because the entire Bible of the psychiatric profession, known as the DSM, or the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which now, by the way, is in its updated version. They actually number them, and the last numbered version was 5, but because they have these interstitial versions that are called transitional versions, it comes to more than that. And now they're dealing with a 5 transitional on the way to the 6th version. So anyway, this stuff is regularly getting revised from year to year. And the importance of that is that it certainly does back up what you said about none of this stuff is written in stone. It gets changed oftentimes in response to science, but just as often, frankly, in response to political leanings. And these political leanings are not just political leagues being brought to bear from outside the profession, but literally are sometimes brought by gatherings involved in all that within the psychiatric profession, who just basically decide that they would like to take psychiatry when it comes to sexual offending in one direction or another. And so one of the reasons why there was positive reform principles about what it would take to be diagnosed as disorder. And by the way, there's every reason in the world to make an argument that that's just complete bunk itself. But the reason why they wouldn't reform it was because this grouping of psychiatrists that were close to power structure of the American Psychiatric Association decided that they just didn't want to do a definition as. The definition, by the way, says that you could be found to be suffering thought-like disorder if you simply had a crime against a child, a sex crime. There doesn't have to be any connection to any psychological malady or symptoms. You just committed a crime. The crime automatically supposedly constitutes the psychological disorder. That's anybody who knows the deal knows that's not how it's done. So that was truly appalling for them to do that, and it slipped in because of the trusting editors who actually took enough faith that what had been submitted was valid. And so they literally put it in there before they realized that by doing so, they were literally inadvertently endorsing this extreme. It's a mess, frankly, when it comes to diagnosis. But the interesting thing about the adverse decision that occurred in 1997 is that it actually requires three things. Only one is the diagnosis. The other two I'll get to real quickly here. Other one is that basically there has to be a lack of control. Okay, we talked about this already. And that's probably the one for which there is no way to determine whether or not somebody is truly in or outside of their self-control, unless from their internal point of view, subjectively, they simply tell you, listen, I'm totally out of control. Probably have very good reason to take their word for it. But short of that, you can't simply say from the outside, especially about somebody who says, no, I'm in perfect control. And you say, oh, no, you're not. And I'll tell you why you're not.
You have 1 minute remaining.
But that doesn't apply psychiatrically or psychologically. Anyway, so that's the other one. Yeah, the other third prong, of course, is that there has to be a much higher than average likelihood of recidivism if you let this guy go. And that, by the way, is subject to risk assessment instruments and evaluations, and we can talk about that maybe next time.
I look forward to that.
Let's go there.
Perfect. Cyrus, what's your last name? Gladden, that's right.
Yeah. And after the talk anytime, I'm sure I'll call you back and we'll probably arrange it again soon. How's that sound?
I look forward to it, man. God bless you, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Okay. Thanks. Same here, Joshua. All right. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Everyone. That's a lot. There's so much more. When I was talking about, does anyone care or will anyone care? What I'm actually asking is, what piece of information is it going to take to make people on the outside care about this? Because their tax dollars going to waste, people don't care because we have senseless wars. We have billions of dollars to give to other countries, but we don't take care of our own people in this country. And I know there's a reason for that, and it's not a good reason, but there's a reason for it. There's a reason for all of this. There's a reason why this is being ignored. There's a reason why they want these people to go away. I care about this a lot. And maybe it's because I've gotten to know family members, or not all, but a lot of them. I've had multiple calls with some of the men that have been locked up. I read the blogs that are written. Preacher's Wife, prime example. We just released another one today. They're human beings. There's monsters prowling everywhere. There's monsters sitting next to you at the bar. There's monsters in your school. There's monsters on the police force. There's monsters in the government. There's monsters in your church. There's monsters that are your next door neighbor. There's probably monsters in your own home. So just crazy. There's so many injustices in the world. There's men, I think they're finally starting to let people out, but there's guys that have been locked up for, and men and women have been locked up for 10 plus years for a little bit of pot, depending on the state that they're in. It's just, this one, just the civil commitment stuff, it's just that it's a nightmare. And I look at it from, I can point at all the stuff that I've said before, and there's really no need to repeat it. But just breaking it down to the fact that some of these people were thrown in there in these shadow prisons under civil commitment based off of hearsay, based off of a false report. And then let's just say that the report was somewhat accurate. It's people that have served their time and were let out and released, freedom, didn't do anything wrong. You heard him say, and I've said this on the other broadcast, and it's actually proven, that sex offenders have, and not serial killers, sex offenders, and I think he said murder, but sex offenders, the recidivism rate, however you say that, in other words, the repeat offender, is the smallest of all repeat offenders. In other words, people typically don't do it again. Why is that? I don't know. What made them do it in the first place? This is a complicated issue. It's not, you can't fit it into a box and just go, oh, this is pretty. Okay, this is how it is. And that's that. It doesn't work that way, even though that's obviously what's happening is they're being put in a box and throwing away the key, and you're never getting out. But life's not that simple. This is not a case of, I'm on video, I blew his brains out. Okay, I deserve to be punished for that. This is way complicated. And yet we're giving psychiatrists. Let me tell you something about psychiatrists. I've dated a few. I don't know why the crazy guy would want to date psychiatrists, but that's what I did. There was a period where I was like, everyone that I was dating was a therapist. And they're all batshit crazy. Every one of them. I've never met a normal therapist. Ever. I wanted to be a therapist, but I'm batshit crazy sometimes. And I'm guessing if I'm listening to people share their thoughts and their feelings and their darkest moments and the craziness that's going on in their head, I would probably be a little bit more whacked out too. But there's not a single psychiatrist or therapist that I've dated that was not an alcoholic, didn't smoke, and didn't do drugs. Maybe one didn't do drugs. Two out of the 7 didn't do drugs. They hated their life. They were always stressed out. They immediately, and they exercised, they worked out, but that wasn't enough. They needed more. And these are the people that are making decisions that get people locked up for the rest of their life with no chance of getting out, all on what? Their opinion. Opinions, it could even be their medical opinion. But when you have a field of psychiatry that constantly changes its own rules and belief system, it's worse than the Catholic Church in this sense. The Catholic churches go in and change the Bible whenever they feel like it, or they change a law whenever they feel that they should do it. They do it. They've been doing this forever. Forever. Like, people walk around as Christians not realizing that their faith has changed, or not their faith, but the religion has changed and been modified, like, over this, since the beginning, like forever. This happens all the time. At the turn of the century, you may It's like every couple hundred years, there's like a massive change in our faith or the Christian faith. Why do you think there's so many different Bibles, so many different versions of Christianity? Psychiatry is no different. Depending on who you were learning from in the field of psychiatry, whatever discipline, it's going to be what you believe and what you teach and what you are putting into practice as you're practicing in your field. There are some psychiatrists that does not believe that borderline personality disorder is a thing. Some people don't believe that multiple personalities are real. Some people don't believe that dissociative identity disorder is a thing. But I'll tell you who does think it's a thing: the government. You know why I know? Because there are scientific studies on mind control. There are scientific studies in how you can purposely give somebody dissociative identity disorder. There's studies, real research that has been around longer than I've been alive. mRNA technology, to some people, that's all over the news now. mRNA has been around for at least 40 years, at least. How do I know? Because in those same very studies that talks about how you give someone DID, dissociative identity disorder, the same studies talk about mRNA technology for mind control. Don't even pretend that you don't think mind control is not a thing, because they talk about it in the mainstream news all the time. And I know what I say about the news, but they tell people, they act like they've stopped doing it. It's kind of like weather warfare, like HARP. Like they act like they stopped, but I don't know. Have you looked at the map today? And just for the heck of it, is December 13th. Have you seen the map today? How in the world is it that the entire United States is under threat of storms, massive, awful storms, where power outages, tornadoes, sleet storms, ice storms, tornadoes, all over the country, all in the same period of 3 to 4 days? And if you've seen the map, it's wild. It's wild. Anyway, there's so much more going on. But the fact is this: give anything that is, when we give somebody absolute authority, you better hope that it's God, that doesn't have a bias, that truly wants the best for everyone, that gives us swift and fair punishment. But when you're giving somebody opinion, the power of God, you have a recipe for danger. Because even the stuff that I'm saying right now, or I've said on any of the other broadcasts, any of that stuff that I've said, if that made one of those therapists mad, and all of a sudden someone wants to make an accusation, even if there's no facts, and then all of a sudden I'm in front of this therapist and they're like, "Oh, you're the guy that's been talking smack about me," and like in the back of their head, they can do whatever they want. And then what's my defense? Oh, you have a bias against me because I made fun of you? No, that doesn't work. That's not that. These people that are getting thrown in these shadow prisons don't even get that opportunity. That's what I'm saying. These therapists have the power of God. And how many of your doctors have been wrong? How many times has your doctor prescribed you the wrong medication? How many of your therapists? By the way, go read about the side effects of antidepressants that are given out like candy. Read about it. Read about how it changes your body, not just what they tell you on TV. Go read the actual studies of the side effects and understand that this ain't good for you. Some of these medications that are prescribed. The long-term effects of Ritalin and what's the Adderall, the antidepressants, the bipolar medications. Read about them. And you think that they're treating your mental health problem? Not even close. But even with that said, let's just say that antidepressant benefited you? Do you remember what it was like when you went to the psychiatrist for the first time to get prescribed the meds? The questions you asked, the medicine, hey, let's try you on this. Let's try you on that and see how you're doing for a couple of months. It's practicing medicine on you. I don't care what anyone says. That's what it is. I know the damage that was done to me because I was misdiagnosed with schizophrenia when I had dissociative identity disorder. The medication I was given made it worse, made me more manic, more crazy than I already was. It made me want to do drugs more. But the side effects go on and on. So the only point I'm trying to make is we're giving a lot of power to people that don't really know it all. Hell, they could be having a bad day and they look at that guy or the girl that's in trouble, and all of a sudden, they got an agenda that day. Maybe they got cut off in traffic. They're a little hungover. They're a little stressed out. It's been a bad day. Someone was mean to them. Someone hurt their feelings. And all of a sudden, they see this guy, this person that's been accused of something that may hit home for them. And I know they're professionals. They're supposed to be objectable and they can remove themselves from that. But you know what? We're all human beings. We're all susceptible to our emotions. And to act like we're not is foolish. Because I promise you that you can tell me that you're so calm, cool, and collective and you're in this meditative state all the time. But I promise you, I could get you to stand up and punch me in the face. I promise you, I could get you to assault me. Some are better at this than others, but I would suggest that the majority are a slave to their emotions in some shape or form. And this is no different for professionals, for psychiatrists, for doctors, or anything else. And don't tell me that doctors are not susceptible to corruption. What do you think the last 2.5 years has been? You want to talk about corruption? So all I'm getting at is this. I'm not defending the act of a sex offender. I'm not doing that. I'll never will. Would I forgive? Yeah, because I've forgiven the people that took advantage of me. I've forgiven the people that molested me. I've forgiven the people that abused me, including myself. There's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way, but what's happening right now is not right. We've given a lot of power to the wrong people, and it's time to get that power back. Because it's not just civil commitment. It's not just civil commitment. There is so many more injustices. But ironically, from what I can tell, they somehow all end up connecting back to the same place. I look forward to having Cyrus back on. Again, I want to give a shout out to everyone at MSOP and MSOP, your family, your loved ones, everyone in Texas and New Jersey. God bless you guys, Kansas. You're in our prayers. California, you're in our prayers, and I would appreciate if you all checked out facebook.com/endmsop. And also to get these hoodies, I would just go contact at embroiderydad.com and just email them and let them know you want one of these hoodies. They come in pink too. Jessica, my wife, has one, and my wife stands with you guys as well. And she didn't at first, by the way. She was a little freaked out, and I can understand why. I was freaked out just because I didn't know how I was going to respond. I didn't know what I was going to meet, who I was going to meet, what I was going to be faced with. But I got to tell you, my heart goes out to all of you. Even the ones that actually were molesters and sex offenders, my heart goes out to you because I don't believe you were born to be that. I don't believe that God created you to be any of those things. So something happened. Something happened and screwed you up, or put you in a position where, for whatever reason, you made a choice that caused somebody else a lot of harm. And it's really easy to point at it and go, it's sex offense. But it could be murder. I think about the things that were said to me and the damage that did. Sometimes the verbal stuff was worse than the physical that happened. Anyway, I could keep talking about this forever, and I'm just going to start to ramble. So I'm going to stop there. But if you're still listening, please keep these guys in your prayers. And if you have started to look into this and you're starting to realize the injustice that goes on and why I've been talking about this for the last year and why this matters to me, I'd be grateful for you guys to purchase one of these sweatshirts. The money goes all to them. All the profits go to help support their mission. They need to tear down these walls of these prisons. There's a better way. There's a better way to help rehabilitate. What they're doing is not it. Thank you for listening.